Picture this. It's 1977. A 22-year-old kid in a Pasadena garage plugs into a 100-watt amp he wasn't really supposed to be using, turns every single dial all the way to the right, which literally no one recommended, and accidentally discovers a sound that would make every other guitarist in the world feel like they were playing the wrong instrument.
Take a second and remember exactly where you were. You know the exact moment I'm talking about. You're sitting right there, near the stereo, you hear the needle drop on that 1978 debut album, and Eruption just tears through the speakers for the very first time. For a lot of us who grew up playing classic rock, that moment is deeply personal. It entirely changed how we looked at the fretboard, and it completely changed how we heard Overdrive.
Today we're going to look at how that massive, warm, and aggressive tone was actually born. And I want you to forget the studio magic and the glossy custom shop catalogs for a minute. Because that sound, it didn't come from sterile engineering. It didn't come from deep pockets. It was born from sheer desperation, broken rules, and a guy who just flat out refused to accept what the factory gave him.
Part 1. Before the Stripes. The Broke Obsessive. You gotta remember, before the fame, before the sold-out arenas, Eddie was just a self-taught kid from a musical family. And he was broke. He simply couldn't afford the professional high-end gear he actually wanted to play. If you were a kid in the 70s trying to get a massive rock sound, you were basically out of luck if you couldn't afford top-shelf equipment.
But he had zero reverence for how a guitar was supposed to be treated. To him, gear wasn't sacred. It was just raw lumber and wire. He would take cheap entry-level guitars, like a Tisco Del Rey or an Ibanez Destroyer, and literally take a saw to them. He destroyed perfectly good instruments just trying to force them to obey his hands.
If you've been playing as long as I have, you totally get the struggle he was facing as a player. He needed the snappy, comfortable feel and the tremolo bar of a Fender Stratocaster, but a standard Strat sounded way too thin for what he wanted. He demanded the thick, roaring, heavy punch of a Gibson humbucker pickup. You know, the kind of pickup that cancels out the background hum and pushes an amp into heavy distortion. But Gibsons just felt too stiff to him.
Part 2. The Frankenstrat. Building a monster. That exact problem led him to Wayne Charvel's guitar parts shop. He didn't buy a pristine guitar body. He dug through a bin and found a heavy, factory-second piece of northern ash wood that had a massive knot right in the middle of it. Because it was defective, he bought it for $50. He slapped an $80 maple neck on it, and his total investment was $130. His construction method to solve his tone problem was absolutely brutal. The hole in that $50 body wasn't nearly big enough for the Gibson ES335 pickup he wanted to drop in, so he literally took a hand chisel and hacked away the wood to widen the cavity. Then, he dipped that pickup in melted surfboard wax, a trick called potting, which basically seals the wire coils inside the pickup so it won't emit that high-pitched screaming feedback when you're standing in front of a loud amp. Finally, he just screwed the pickup directly into the bare wood at a slight angle just so the magnetic poles would properly line up with his strings.
And he didn't stop there. He ripped out all the complicated wiring. No tone pots, no pickup selector switches, nothing. He wired that single pickup straight to a single volume knob. And just as a joke, he took a plastic knob that said tone and stuck it on the volume control. By removing all those extra electronics, he created a signal that was naked, immediate, and violently strong. It was a direct pipeline from his fingers to the amplifier.
Part 3. The Wrong Amp and the Variac Trick. The second half of this equation came when he bought a used 1967 Marshall Superlead amp from an ad in the newspaper. It was imported from England, but there was a catch. It was accidentally wired for 220 volts, which is the European standard, instead of the American 110-volt standard. So when he plugged it into a standard wall outlet in California, it was receiving half the power it actually needed. It turned on, sure, but it was incredibly quiet. To fix this voltage issue, he went to a local radio supply shop and bought a Variac. A Variac is just a heavy, industrial dial used to manually lower or raise the electrical voltage feeding into a piece of machinery. He didn't buy it to be some clever engineer, he just bought it to use as a massive light dimmer for his amp, so he could make the amp behave differently than it was ever designed to. He set the Variac to lower the voltage going into the amplifier. Imagine turning down the power of a car engine, but keeping the gas pedal completely pressed to the floor. The amp was sweating. It was working harder than it should at a lower overall volume. This created what we guitarists call sag, which is a natural compression and warmth where the vacuum tubes are physically struggling to keep up with the notes you're playing, giving you this smooth, singing distortion you could actually feel vibrating in your chest. Now, this created a massive myth in the guitar community. In a legendary 1978 interview, Eddie flat out lied to keep his secret safe. He said he cranked the Variac up to 140 volts. Kids everywhere tried this, sending massive power surges into their amps and literally blowing them up. In reality, he was starving the amp down to about 90 volts to get that sweet, dying tube saturation.
Part 4, 1978, the Sunset Sound Collision. All of these scrapped together, desperate accidents collided perfectly in early 1978. The band walked into Studio One at Sunset Sound to record their debut album. Eddie brought the $50 chunk of wood, the wax-dipped pickup, and that voltage-starved Marshall.
This wasn't some pristine studio creation. From the dusty Pasadena garage to loud, sweaty club gigs at places like Magic Mountain, right onto the studio floor. That specific combination of the hacked guitar and the starving amp was captured almost completely live in the studio, exactly as he played it on stage. The engineer, Don Landee, was smart enough not to overcomplicate it. He took that Marshall amp with all the dials turned up to 10 and threw the guitar hard into the left speaker channel. Then he drenched it in the studio's live echo chamber, some plate reverb, which is just a mechanical way of creating room echo using large metal sheets, and tape echo, which uses loops of magnetic recording tape to create a warm, repeating delay.
The result changed the landscape of rock music overnight. It didn't sound like a carefully produced, multi-tracked studio trick. It sounded alive. It sounded dangerous, completely untamed, and bursting with physical energy. It truly sounded like a band trying to outrun the cops.
Part 5, the expensive irony. Which brings us to the ultimate punchline of the whole Brown sound myth, and the irony here is thick enough to cut with a knife.
Thousands of guitarists, and yeah, maybe even some of us, have spent decades and tens of thousands of dollars trying to buy a tone that originally came from a kid essentially breaking his equipment. We buy boutique pedals and expensive amps, trying to replicate a sound born from dropping wall voltage, boiling pickups and surfboard wax, and playing an instrument bolted together from mismatched, factory reject spare parts. Today, you can buy a custom-shop museum replica of the Frankenstrat for $25,000. The original cost $130.
Because at the end of the day, you can perfectly recreate the electrical circuit. You can buy the exact Northern Ash wood, you can lower the voltage to exactly 90 volts, but you can't buy Eddie's hands. You can't clone his aggressive, slicing right-hand attack, his incredibly loose grip on the pick, or the exact way he muted the strings. The player's hands are the final piece of the circuit that actually drove the whole machine.
So I leave you with this to argue about at your next jam session. When you think about that roaring tone that defined an entire era of classic rock, was the man a sheer sonic genius who saw things no one else saw? Or was he just a broke, stubborn kid who hacked his gear out of necessity and got incredibly lucky to stumble onto something nobody else was looking for?